They called it overbuilt, overweight, overhyped. A jet too big to dogfight, too expensive to maintain, too ugly to inspire. When American engineers unveiled the F-4 Phantom in the late 1950s, Soviet analysts laughed. A bomber pretending to be a fighter, they wrote in classified reports stamped with red ink. It will never rule the skies, but they were wrong. By the end of the 20th century, the Phantom had flown in every major conflict, under a dozen flags, and had rewritten the book on air power. It broke 16 world records, humbled rivals across 6 continents, and proved that sometimes the world's most doubted machines become legends. This is the story of the jet everyone dismissed, the machine that conquered every sky. The year was 1953, and the smoke of the Korean War still hung in the air like an accusation. In the sterile corridors of the Pentagon, admirals studied kill ratios with the grim precision of coroners. American jets had performed adequately, but adequately wasn't enough. Not when the Soviets were building faster, climbing higher, and turning tighter with each new MiG that rolled out of their factories. The U.S. Navy found itself facing an impossible equation. Aircraft carriers demanded fighters that could launch from short decks and land in rolling seas. But those same fighters needed to intercept bombers at 30,000 feet, shoot down missiles in storm clouds, and strike targets hundreds of miles inland. The mathematics of physics seemed to mock the ambition. No single aircraft could excel at everything. In a modest hangar in St. Louis, Missouri, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation was about to prove physics wrong. James McDonnell, a man whose wire-rimmed glasses couldn't hide the fire in his eyes, stood before a room of Navy procurement officers. Behind him, a blueprint stretched across the wall like a fever dream of engineering ambition. Twin engines, massive fuselage, a tail that drooped downward in defiance of every aesthetic principle known to aviation. "Gentlemen," McDonnell said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had calculated the impossible, "what you're looking at is the future of naval aviation. One aircraft, any mission, any weather." The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Rear Admiral John Dale leaned back in his chair, studying the blueprint with the expression of a man examining a broken clock. "Mr. McDonnell, we need fighters, not flying warehouses. This thing looks like it was designed by committee." McDonnell smiled. "Admiral, sometimes committees get it right." But across the Atlantic, in the gray concrete corridors of the Kremlin, Soviet military analysts were having a very different conversation. General Pavel Kutakov, head of the Soviet Air Force, spread American intelligence photographs across his desk like tarot cards predicting disaster. The images showed the early mock-ups of what would become the F-4 Phantom, and Kutakov's weathered face creased into something approaching amusement. "Look at this monstrosity," he said to his aide, Colonel Viktor Provolov. "The Americans want to build a fighter that weighs as much as a bomber and carries as much electronics as a radar station. They've forgotten that wars are won by pilots, not computers." Provolov nodded dutifully. In the Soviet military doctrine of the 1950s, such thinking was gospel. Simplicity meant reliability. Human skill trumped technological complexity. The greatest aces of the Great Patriotic War had flown nimble fighters with mechanical controls and iron sights. Why complicate what worked? "Mark my words, Victor," Kutakov continued, lighting a cigarette and watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "This F-4 will be the most expensive failure in American aviation history. You cannot make a fighter jet out of a flying computer." The general was not alone in his assessment. Across the Soviet military establishment, the emerging reports of the American all-weather fighter were met with a mixture of derision and strategic dismissal. In the halls of the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, engineers focused on perfecting the MiG-21 interceptor, a pure expression of Soviet aviation philosophy: light, fast, simple, lethal. "Let the Americans build their complicated toys," said Artem Mikoyan himself during a design review meeting. "We will build fighters." By 1956, the joke had acquired wings. McDonnell's design team, led by Chief Engineer Dave Lewis, had transformed their wild concept into something that barely resembled conventional aviation. The YF-4H prototype squatted on the tarmac of Lambert Field like a metallic predator that had evolved in some parallel universe where the laws of aerodynamics were merely suggestions. Its fuselage stretched 58 feet from nose to tail, wider than many bombers and heavier than anything that had ever tried to land on a carrier deck. Two General Electric J79 turbojet engines hung beneath the wings like afterburner-equipped thunder gods, each capable of producing 17,000 pounds of thrust. The nose cone housed a radar system so complex it required its own cooling system. And that tail, that impossible downward-angled tail that made aviation purists wince, defied every principle of aerodynamic beauty. "If it flies," Lewis told his exhausted design team during one of their marathon sessions, "it will fly like nothing else." The conditional tense was important. Nobody was entirely certain it would fly at all. Test pilot Bob Little, a former Navy aviator whose calm demeanor masked a calculated recklessness, walked around the prototype with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to spot potential failure modes before they became obituary material. The Phantom dwarfed him, its air intakes gaping like the mouths of mechanical sharks. "She's not pretty," Little admitted to the gathered engineers and Navy officials, "but ugly airplanes sometimes surprise you." The Navy's investment was reluctant at best. Admiral Dale, the same man who had questioned McDonnell's sanity 3 years earlier, had approved test funding only after Congress threatened to find alternative contractors. The Air Force, meanwhile, maintained its institutional skepticism with the fervor of a religious conviction. "Navy toys don't win wars," Air Force General Curtis LeMay declared during a joint service meeting. "Bombers win wars. Fighters just clear the way." But in Moscow, Soviet intelligence analysts were beginning to pay closer attention. The initial dismissal was giving way to curiosity, though that curiosity remained heavily seasoned with doubt. A classified GRU report from late 1956 described the F-4 project as a technological delusion born of American materialism, but recommended continued monitoring. Colonel Provolov, now promoted to head the Foreign Aviation Assessment Division, found himself studying grainy photographs of the Phantom prototype with growing unease. The jet was undeniably large, complex, and expensive, everything Soviet doctrine taught them to avoid, but it was also undeniably ambitious in ways that made him uncomfortable. "What troubles me," he confided to his deputy during a late-night briefing session, "is not what this aircraft can do, but what it represents. The Americans are not building a fighter. They're building a flying weapon system." His deputy, a young major named Alexei Fedorov, who would later become one of the Soviet Union's most decorated test pilots, studied the photographs with fresh eyes. "Comrade Colonel, perhaps that's exactly what the future requires." Provolov's expression darkened. Such thinking bordered on heresy in the Soviet military establishment of the 1950s. The cult of the ace pilot, the belief in human superiority over mechanical complexity, ran too deep to be questioned by a mere major. "Fedorov," Provolov said carefully, "remember that wars are won by men, not machines. The Americans may build their electronic marvels, but when the shooting starts, it will be pilot against pilot, as it has always been." But even as he spoke the words, Provolov felt the first stirrings of doubt. The photographs showed mounting points for missiles he had never seen before, radar dishes that suggested detection ranges far beyond anything in the Soviet inventory, and fuel tanks that promised combat radii that could reach from carriers to targets deep inland. On May 27, 1958, that doubt crystallized into something approaching fear. Bob Little strapped himself into the prototype's cockpit as the St. Louis morning sun painted the tarmac gold. The Phantom's engines spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, their exhaust creating heat mirages that made the air itself seem to tremble. Little advanced the throttles, felt 34,000 pounds of thrust push him back into his ejection seat, and watched the runway disappear beneath him at an acceleration that redefined his understanding of what aircraft could do. The Phantom climbed at an angle that should have caused it to stall and tumble. Instead, It rose like an elevator to heaven, its twin engines painting contrails against the morning sky. At 20,000 feet, Little pushed the aircraft into a dive that should have torn its wings off. The Phantom responded with the stability of a rifle bullet, its speed indicator climbing past numbers that belonged in textbooks, not cockpits. When Little brought the prototype back to Lambert Field 47 minutes later, he was grinning with the expression of a man who had glimpsed the future and found it exhilarating. The telemetry data told a story that aviation engineers would study for decades. The Phantom had reached Mach 1.8 on its first flight. Its radar had locked onto targets at ranges that exceeded the performance of ground-based systems. Its engines had operated flawlessly at altitudes where other aircraft gasped for air. McDonnell's chief engineer Dave Lewis studied the data with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose impossible equations had proven correct. Around him, the engineers who had spent 3 years turning blueprints into reality celebrated with the restrained enthusiasm of people who knew they had just witnessed history. "Gentlemen," Lewis said, raising a cup of coffee in lieu of champagne, "what began as a joke is about to become the most feared silhouette on radar screens for the next 30 years. He was wrong about the timeline. It would be 40 years. The wind tunnel at McDonnell Aircraft in 1957 screamed with the voice of science pushing against the boundaries of the possible. Inside the test chamber, a scale model of the F-4 Phantom trembled under artificial hurricane winds that would have shredded a real aircraft into aluminum confetti. Engineers in white coats watched pressure readings climb into ranges that should have meant structural failure, but the model held. Dr. Edward Heinemann, McDonnell's chief aerodynamicist, stood before a blackboard covered in equations that looked like the mathematical equivalent of abstract art. Drag coefficients, lift ratios, and stability calculations filled every square inch of available space, each number representing hours of computation performed by teams of engineers with slide rules and mechanical calculators. "The physics are wrong," Heinemann announced to the gathered design team, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who had spent decades making aircraft behave according to natural law. "This aircraft should not be able to fly. It's too big, too heavy, too complex. The drag alone should make it perform like a flying refrigerator." But the wind tunnel data told a different story. The Phantom's massive fuselage, rather than creating insurmountable drag, was generating lift through principles that seemed to mock conventional wisdom. The downward-angled tail, initially dismissed as an aesthetic nightmare, was providing stability that allowed the aircraft to maintain control at speeds where other fighters became uncontrollable missiles. Dave Lewis, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened from another 18-hour design session, approached the blackboard with the deliberate steps of a man carrying the weight of an impossible project. "Ed, the physics aren't wrong. We're just looking at new physics. The radar system was the source of their biggest headaches and their greatest breakthrough. The AN/APQ-72 fire control radar packed into the Phantom's nose cone was more complex than the guidance systems of most intercontinental ballistic missiles. It generated so much heat that it required its own cooling system. It drew so much power that it demanded a dedicated generator, and it weighed so much that it shifted the aircraft's center of gravity into previously unexplored territory." Tom Berger, the lead avionics engineer, had been living on coffee and aspirin for 3 months. His team worked in a climate-controlled facility that hummed with the sound of prototype electronics being pushed beyond their design limits. Banks of vacuum tubes glowed like the instruments of electronic sorcery, their cathode screens painting ghostly green images of targets that existed only in the realm of mathematics. "The radar sees everything," Berger explained during a progress briefing, his words carrying the exhaustion of a man who had been wrestling with technology that belonged in the next decade. "Rain, fog, darkness, electronic jamming, it cuts through everything like a knife through smoke. But the heat signature is killing us. We're cooking our own electronics." The solution came from an unexpected source. Jerry Kindleberger, a junior engineer fresh out of MIT, suggested using the aircraft's own airflow as a cooling system. By channeling ram air through the radar compartment, they could keep the electronics within operating temperature while using the Phantom's speed as its own air conditioning. "It's either brilliant or insane," Lewis admitted after reviewing Kindleberger's proposal. But at this point, those might be the same thing. Meanwhile, the engines were teaching McDonnell's engineers new lessons about the relationship between power and control. The twin General Electric J79s were the most powerful turbojet engines ever installed in a fighter aircraft. Each one produced thrust equivalent to a small locomotive, and when both were running at full afterburner, the Phantom generated enough power to overcome aerodynamic laws that had governed aviation since the Wright brothers. But power without control was merely expensive destruction. The Phantom's flight control system had to be completely reimagined to handle forces that no pilot could manage through physical strength alone. Hydraulic actuators replaced mechanical linkages. Computer-assisted stability systems compensated for the aircraft's size and weight. The pilot became less a controller of the aircraft than a director of its electronic orchestra. Bob Little, still serving as the primary test pilot, spent his days learning to fly an aircraft that redefined the meaning of flight. Each test flight revealed new capabilities and new challenges. The Phantom could climb at angles that turned the horizon into a vertical line. It could dive at speeds that compressed time and distance into a blur of sensation. But it could also become uncontrollable if the pilot forgot that he was no longer flying a machine. He was conducting a symphony of thrust, electronics, and aerodynamics. "She's not like anything else," Little reported after a particularly challenging test flight that had explored the aircraft's high-altitude performance. "When you push the throttles forward, you don't accelerate, you transcend. But you have to think 3 moves ahead, like playing chess with the laws of physics." The test data was rewriting aviation textbooks in real time. The Phantom's maximum speed exceeded Mach 2.2, making it faster than most missiles. Its service ceiling reached altitudes where the sky turned purple and the curve of the Earth became visible. Its combat radius extended beyond the range of most bombers, turning the traditional distinction between fighters and attack aircraft into an obsolete concept. Yet for every breakthrough, the engineers discovered new problems that tested their sanity and their budgets. The Phantom's size made it difficult to hangar on aircraft carriers. Its weight stressed catapult systems beyond their design limits. Its complexity required maintenance procedures that resembled space program protocols more than traditional aircraft servicing. "We're not building a fighter," confided Chief Engineer Lewis to his wife during one of their rare dinners together. "We're building a flying research laboratory that happens to carry weapons." But the weapons themselves were part of the revolution. The Phantom was designed around missiles rather than guns, a philosophical shift that challenged every assumption about air combat. The AIM-7 Sparrow missiles hung beneath its wings like electronic javelins, each one guided by radar systems that could track targets beyond visual range. The AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles promised to turn air combat into a long-range chess match rather than a close-quarters knife fight. Dr. Werner von Braun, visiting McDonnell as a consultant, studied the Phantom's weapon systems with the appreciation of a man who understood the marriage of technology and destruction. "What you have created," he told the design team, "is not an aircraft. It is a flying weapons platform that represents the future of warfare." But that future seemed increasingly uncertain as cost overruns mounted and technical challenges multiplied. The Navy's initial enthusiasm was cooling as budget projections climbed into ranges that made admirals wince. The Air Force remained skeptical, viewing the Phantom as an expensive solution to problems that could be solved more simply with specialized aircraft. The morning of December 30th, 1960, dawned gray and forbidding over the Mojave Desert. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like artillery preparing for bombardment, and the wind carried the scent of rain that would turn the test range into a mud-soaked nightmare for any conventional aircraft operation. It was perfect weather for proving the Phantom's most audacious claim. Commander John Glenn, the same man who would later orbit the Earth in a Mercury capsule, strapped himself into the F-4H-1's cockpit with the methodical precision of a pilot who had learned to trust his life to engineering calculations. The weather briefing had been ominous. Zero visibility, turbulence that would rattle a bomber, and electrical storms that could fry unprotected electronics. "Control, this is Ghost Rider," Glenn's voice crackled through the radio, using the Phantom's test program call sign. Weather looks nasty enough to test this thing properly. The AN/APQ-72 radar painted the storm system in electronic detail that revealed its structure like a three-dimensional map. Where human eyes saw only gray oblivion, the Phantom's sensors detected wind patterns, precipitation density, and clear air pockets that offered paths through the chaos. Glenn advanced the throttles and disappeared into the storm like a technological ghost. For 47 minutes, the Phantom flew through weather that would have grounded every other aircraft in the Navy's inventory. The radar guided Glenn around the worst turbulence while maintaining lock on simulated targets at ranges exceeding 30 miles. The aircraft's stability systems compensated for wind shear that would have tumbled lighter fighters into uncontrolled spins. The engines ingested rain and hail without missing a beat, their intake systems designed to process water like air. When Glenn emerged from the storm system, his voice carried the awe of a pilot who had experienced something unprecedented in aviation history. "Control, Ghost Rider. I just flew through hell, and this bird never lost her manners. The all-weather claim isn't marketing, it's reality." The data from that flight became the foundation of the Phantom's reputation. In a single mission, the F-4 had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about fighter aircraft limitations. It could operate in conditions that grounded other aircraft. It could engage targets that other fighters couldn't detect. It could perform missions that required the capabilities of multiple specialized aircraft. But the real vindication came in the form of numbers that spoke louder than any pilot's testimony. Between 1959 and 1962, the F-4 Phantom shattered 16 official world records with the casual efficiency of a sledgehammer breaking glass. It climbed to 98,556 feet, reaching altitudes where the sky turned black and the earth curved like a blue marble. It achieved speeds of 1,606 miles per hour, moving faster than most rifle bullets. It climbed from sea level to 30,000 feet in 114 seconds, ascending like a rocket with wings. Each record fell with mathematical precision that left aviation experts struggling to process the implications. The Phantom wasn't just exceeding previous performance standards, it was transcending them into realms that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than operational reality. Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier and a pilot whose opinion carried the weight of legend, flew the Phantom during its evaluation program and emerged from the cockpit with the expression of a man who had glimpsed the future of aviation. "Boys," Yeager drawled to the assembled test pilots and engineers, "this bird doesn't just fly fast, it flies angry. And it flies like it's got a personal grudge against gravity." But the ultimate test came not from record-setting flights or weather penetration missions, but from the most basic requirement of military aviation, proving itself against other fighters in head-to-head competition. The Air Force, still skeptical of the Navy's flying computer, arranged a series of fly-off demonstrations that would pit the Phantom against every fighter in the American inventory. F-100 Super Sabres, F-104 Starfighters, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, each representing the pinnacle of specialized fighter design, would compete against McDonnell's all-weather experiment in scenarios designed to expose the compromises inherent in any multi-role aircraft. The competitions took place at Edwards Air Force Base under conditions that ensured objective evaluation. Radar tracking measured intercept times. Gun cameras recorded weapon solutions. Telemetry data captured performance parameters that couldn't be fudged or interpreted charitably. The results defied every prediction made by Air Force analysts. In intercept missions, the Phantom's radar allowed it to detect and engage targets before other fighters knew they were under attack. In air-to-air combat, its missile systems provided engagement ranges that turned dogfights into long-range duels. In ground attack missions, its payload capacity and navigation systems delivered ordnance with precision that matched specialized attack aircraft. Most shocking of all, in pure dogfighting scenarios where the Phantom's size and weight should have been decisive disadvantages, its thrust-to-weight ratio and advanced flight controls allowed it to compete with fighters designed specifically for close combat. General John McConnell, Air Force Chief of Staff, watched the demonstration flights with the expression of a man witnessing the collapse of his fundamental assumptions about military aviation. When the final scores were tallied, the Phantom had won every single category of competition. "Gentlemen," McConnell announced to his staff, his voice carrying the reluctant admiration of a convert, "we may have been asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking whether one aircraft can do everything, we should have been asking why we need multiple aircraft when one can do everything better." The Air Force order for 583 F-4C Phantoms, announced 6 months later, represented more than a procurement decision. It was an acknowledgment that the fundamental nature of fighter aviation had changed forever. But the most telling vindication came from an unexpected source. In Moscow, Colonel Viktor Provolov received a classified intelligence summary that made him pause in the middle of his morning tea. American F-4 Phantoms had not only met their performance specifications, they had exceeded them by margins that suggested revolutionary rather than evolutionary advancement in aviation technology. "Comrade Colonel," his aide reported nervously, "the Americans have achieved something we considered impossible. Their all-weather fighter performs better than our specialized interceptors in intercept missions, better than our fighter bombers in ground attack missions, and competitive with our dogfighters in air combat missions." Provolov set down his tea with the careful precision of a man processing information that challenged his worldview. The Soviet Union had built its aviation philosophy on the principle of specialized aircraft for specialized missions. The idea that one aircraft could excel at everything had been dismissed as American technological hubris. "What does this mean for our own programs?" Provolov asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Sir, it means we may need to reconsider our entire approach to fighter development." The implications rippled through the Soviet military establishment like seismic shockwaves. If the Americans had solved the multi-role fighter problem, then the Soviet Union's inventory of specialized aircraft might become obsolete overnight. The MiG-21 interceptor, the Su-7 fighter bomber, the MiG-19 dogfighter, each representing years of development and billions of rubles, might all be superseded by a single American design that could perform all their missions more effectively. As 1962 drew to a close, the F-4 Phantom was no longer an experimental curiosity or a technological gamble. It had become the new standard by which all other fighters would be measured, a benchmark that forced aviation engineers around the world to reconsider their understanding of what aircraft could achieve. The joke had become a revolution. The ugly duckling had revealed itself to be a steel swan with afterburners. And the sky, once divided among specialized aircraft designed for specific missions, was about to be unified under the thunder of twin J-79 engines. The age of the multi-role fighter had begun, and it spoke with an American accent that carried the sound of controlled thunder. The morning mist clung to the flight deck of USS Constellation like a shroud as Lieutenant Commander Mike Nelson walked his pre-flight inspection around the F-4B Phantom that would carry him into his first combat mission over North Vietnam. It was March 17, 1965, and the humid air of the South China Sea carried the weight of history about to be written in contrails and gunfire. Nelson's Phantom, tail number 1FEEN3019, squatted on the catapult like a predator preparing to strike. 28,000 pounds of metal, electronics, and explosive potential, painted in the gray camouflage that would become synonymous with American air power over Southeast Asia. The twin J-79 engines hung beneath the wings like technological promises of violence, their afterburner rings gleaming in the early morning sun. "First time taking the Rhino to the dance?" asked Commander Bill Diesel Morrison, the squadron's most experienced pilot, using the nickname that had already attached itself to the massive fighter. Nelson nodded, his helmet under his arm and his expression carrying the mixture of excitement and apprehension common to pilots about to discover whether years of training translated into survival. "She's bigger than anything I've ever flown into combat." "Bigger, louder, and meaner," Morrison confirmed. "But remember, Charlie doesn't know that yet." The intelligence briefing had been sobering. North Vietnamese air defenses were concentrated around strategic targets with a density that surprised American planners. MiG-17s and the newer MiG-21s, operated from airfields that seemed to multiply faster than American intelligence could catalog them. Soviet advisors had transformed North Vietnam's air defense system into a technological gauntlet that would test every assumption about modern air warfare. But the Phantom represented a new paradigm in aerial combat. Its APQ-72 radar could detect enemy aircraft at ranges that exceeded visual contact by factors of 10. Its AIM-7 Sparrow missiles promised to turn air combat into a long-range precision engagement rather than the close-quarters knife fights that had characterized previous wars. Its speed and altitude performance should have made it invulnerable to anything the North Vietnamese could deploy. Should have. The first hint that reality might diverge from theory came during Nelson's second mission, a combat air patrol over the Red River Valley. His radar had painted a formation of unidentified aircraft approaching from the northwest, and the engagement parameters looked like a textbook example of beyond visual range interception. "Showtime, this is Phantom Lead," Nelson called over the radio, using his mission call sign. "I have multiple bogies bearing 270, range 40 miles and closing. Request permission to engage." "Phantom Lead, cleared to engage. Make it count." Nelson triggered his AIM-7 Sparrow missiles at a range of 25 miles, watching the white smoke trails arc toward targets that existed only as electronic blips on his radar screen. According to the training scenarios, the engagement should have been over in 60 seconds with multiple enemy aircraft destroyed and the Phantom formation continuing their patrol. Instead, the missiles failed to guide properly, their radar seekers confused by ground clutter and electronic interference that hadn't appeared in the sterile environment of test ranges. The MiG-17s, older and supposedly obsolete, closed the distance with the relentless efficiency of aircraft designed for close combat rather than electronic warfare. What followed was Nelson's introduction to the brutal reality that would define American air operations over Vietnam for the next 8 years. The Phantom's size and weight, theoretical disadvantages that should have been overcome by superior technology, became critical liabilities in close combat. The MiG-17s, lighter and more maneuverable, turned inside the American fighters with the agility of hornets attacking eagles. "Jesus Christ!" Nelson's radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Dave Parker, shouted over the intercom as a MiG-17 flashed past their canopy close enough to see the pilot's face. "He's turning inside us like we're standing still." The Phantom's lack of an internal gun, a design decision based on the assumption that future air combat would be conducted at missile ranges, became a critical disadvantage when the missiles failed to perform as advertised. Nelson found himself flying a 28,000-pound fighter that couldn't dogfight and couldn't shoot when the enemy closed to gun range. The mission ended with no kills for either side, but the psychological impact on American aircrews was profound. The Phantom, the aircraft that had shattered every world record and outperformed every competitor, had been fought to a draw by aircraft that belonged in aviation museums. The pattern repeated itself across the skies of North Vietnam with depressing regularity. Phantom formations would detect enemy aircraft at long range, fire missiles that failed to guide properly, and then find themselves engaged in close combat for which they were neither designed nor optimized. The loss rates began to climb as American pilots learned the difference between test range perfection and combat reality. Captain Rob Teschner, flying his 15th mission over North Vietnam, summed up the growing frustration during a debriefing aboard USS Enterprise. "We've got the best radar in the world, the best missiles in the world, and the best training in the world. But when the missiles don't work and Charlie gets inside gun range, we're flying expensive targets." The North Vietnamese pilots, many trained by Soviet instructors who had developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize American technological advantages, exploited every weakness in Phantom operations with surgical precision. They engaged at low altitudes where radar performance degraded. They used tight formations that confused missile guidance systems. They forced close combat where pilot skill and aircraft agility mattered more than electronic sophistication. Soviet advisors, analyzing American tactics from intelligence reports and captured equipment, felt a grim satisfaction as their predictions about the Phantom's limitations proved accurate. Colonel Viktor Provolov, now serving as a senior advisor to the North Vietnamese Air Force, sent regular reports to Moscow that painted the F-4 as a technological marvel hampered by tactical inflexibility. The American pilots are prisoners of their own technology, Provolov wrote in a classified assessment. They have built an aircraft that excels when their equipment functions perfectly, but collapses when subjected to the chaos of actual combat. Their reliance on missiles and radar has made them forget the fundamentals of aerial warfare. The psychological impact extended beyond individual aircrews to the highest levels of American military command. The Phantom had been sold to Congress and the public as a revolutionary advance in military aviation, a technological solution to the challenges of modern warfare. Its early performance over Vietnam suggested that the revolution might have been premature. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, reviewing lost statistics during a Pentagon briefing, expressed the frustration of an administration that had placed enormous faith in technological solutions to military problems. We invested billions of dollars in the most advanced fighter aircraft in history, and it's being outfought by aircraft that were obsolete when the Eisenhower administration took office. But the Phantom's early struggles in Vietnam revealed as much about American tactical doctrine as they did about aircraft design. The rules of engagement imposed by political considerations required visual identification of targets before engagement, negating the radar advantages that were the Phantom's greatest strength. The prohibition against attacking enemy airfields allowed North Vietnamese fighters to operate from sanctuary, controlling the timing and location of aerial engagements. Most critically, American pilot training had focused on intercept missions against bomber formations, rather than dogfighting against maneuverable fighters. The Phantom crews found themselves fighting a type of war for which they had not been prepared in aircraft designed for different missions. The transformation began not in the sterile environment of training facilities or the theoretical realm of tactical planning, but in the brutal classroom of aerial combat where lessons were written in smoke trails and paid for in blood. Captain Steve Ritchie stood beside his F-4D Phantom on the ramp at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, studying the aircraft with the clinical attention of a surgeon examining a patient that had survived multiple operations. It was July 1972, and Ritchie's Phantom bore the scars of 37 combat missions over North Vietnam. Bullet holes patched with aluminum tape, paint worn away by the heat of repeated afterburner operations, and the kind of mechanical weariness that came from pushing sophisticated equipment beyond its design limits. But this Phantom was different from the aircraft that had first entered combat 7 years earlier. An M61 Vulcan cannon pod hung beneath the centerline, its 6 rotating barrels promising 6,000 rounds per minute of 20mm destruction. The radar had been upgraded with combat modifications that improved its ability to function in the electronic warfare environment over North Vietnam. Most importantly, the pilot flying it had learned lessons that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "She's not pretty anymore," Ritchie's radar intercept officer, Captain Chuck de Bellevue, observed as he completed his own pre-flight inspection. "But she's meaner than when we started." The evolution of Phantom tactics had been written in the margins of after-action reports, and paid for with the lives of aircrews who discovered the aircraft's limitations at the worst possible moments. American pilots had learned to use the Phantom's speed and altitude performance to dictate the terms of engagement rather than accepting the close combat that played to enemy strengths. They had developed techniques for employing missiles in the degraded electronic environment of actual warfare. Most crucially, they had learned to think of the Phantom not as a technological solution to aerial combat, but as a platform that required human skill to achieve its potential. The results were beginning to show in the kill statistics that Pentagon analysts studied with the intensity of archaeologists deciphering ancient texts. American air-to-air success rates were climbing as pilots and radar intercept officers developed the tactical expertise to exploit their aircraft's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses. On August 28, 1972, that expertise translated into the kind of engagement that would redefine the Phantom's reputation in aerial warfare. Ritchie and de Bellevue were flying MiGCAP, combat air patrol designed to protect strike formations from enemy fighter interference, when their radar detected a formation of 4 MiG-21s approaching from the northwest. The engagement parameters looked familiar. North Vietnamese fighters attempting to intercept American bombers before they could reach their targets. But this time, the Phantom crew was ready. "Devil 01, this is Red Crown," the radio crackled with the voice of the shipboard radar controller. "Multiple bandits bearing 340, range 60 miles, altitude unknown. Cleared to intercept." Ritchie banked his Phantom toward the threat bearing, the twin J-79 engines responding with the controlled violence that had become second nature after hundreds of combat hours. But instead of rushing toward a long-range missile engagement, he climbed to 35,000 feet and positioned himself between the sun and the approaching MiGs. "Chuck, what's the geometry look like?" Ritchie asked his radar intercept officer. "4 contacts in combat spread, probably MiG-21s based on their speed and altitude. They're staying low, trying to get under our radar coverage." The tactical situation was developing exactly as Ritchie had learned to exploit. The MiG-21s were fast and maneuverable, but their pilots were constrained by North Vietnamese ground control procedures that limited their tactical flexibility. The Phantoms, operating under more flexible command and control, could choose their engagement parameters. Ritchie waited until the geometry was perfect. Enemy aircraft crossing beneath him at a slight angle that would allow a high-speed slashing attack with minimal exposure to defensive fire. Then he rolled inverted and pulled the Phantom into a diving attack that accelerated the 28,000-pound fighter to over 600 knots. "Tally-ho!" de Bellevue called out as the MiG formation became visually apparent. 4 MiG-21s in trail formation, 11 o'clock low. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile that Ritchie fired at a range of 8 miles guided perfectly, its radar seeker maintaining lock on the lead MiG despite the electronic countermeasures that had frustrated earlier engagements. The missile's 88-pound warhead detonated close enough to the MiG to shred its control surfaces, sending the North Vietnamese fighter tumbling toward the jungle in a ball of flame and metal. But Ritchie wasn't finished. The Phantom's speed carried him through the enemy formation before the remaining MiGs could react, positioning him for a second attack as the North Vietnamese pilots struggled to locate their attacker. A second Sparrow missile found its mark, and another MiG-21 disintegrated in the sky over North Vietnam. "Splash 2, de Bellevue reported, his voice carrying the professional satisfaction of a job executed perfectly. "Devil 01 has 2 confirmed kills." The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes from initial radar contact to final kill confirmation. The Phantom formation continued their patrol with minimal expenditure of fuel or ammunition, ready to engage additional threats if required. It was exactly the kind of tactical execution that the aircraft had been designed to achieve, finally realized through the hard-won experience of pilots who had learned to fight with their technology rather than despite it. The kill marked Ritchie as the first American ace of the Vietnam War. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the Phantom could dominate aerial combat when employed by crews who understood its capabilities and limitations. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as too large and complex for dogfighting was proving that dogfighting itself might be an obsolete concept in an era of radar-guided missiles and beyond visual range engagement. Across the Pacific, in the sterile corridors of the Pentagon, air warfare analysts studied the engagement reports with the intensity of scholars discovering lost manuscripts. The tactical lessons emerging from Vietnam were forcing a complete reevaluation of air combat doctrine and aircraft design philosophy. General John Vogt, commander of 7th Air Force, summarized the evolution in a classified briefing to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "The Phantom isn't a failure. We just had to learn how to use it. When employed properly, it's the most effective air superiority fighter in the world." But the aircraft's evolution extended beyond air-to-air combat. American ground commanders had discovered that the Phantom's payload capacity and navigation systems made it devastatingly effective in close air support missions. Its ability to carry 16,000 pounds of ordnance, more than most World War II bombers, transformed it from a specialized interceptor into a flying artillery battery. Colonel Robin Olds, the legendary fighter pilot who commanded the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, flew the Phantom in both air-to-air and ground attack missions with equal enthusiasm. His assessment of the aircraft captured the grudging respect that had developed among aircrews who had initially viewed it as an overweight technological experiment. "The Phantom is like a beautiful woman with a bad personality," Olds observed during a squadron briefing. "She's difficult, demanding, and expensive to maintain. But when you need her most, she'll deliver more than you thought possible." The aircraft's versatility was revealing itself in ways that surprised even its designers. Phantoms flew reconnaissance missions deep into North Vietnamese airspace, their cameras and electronic sensors gathering intelligence that shaped strategic planning. They performed aerial refueling missions, extending the range of other fighters through innovative tactics that hadn't existed when the aircraft entered service. They even flew search and rescue missions, their speed and firepower providing protection for recovery operations in hostile territory. By 1968, the F-4 Phantom had transcended its role as an American military aircraft to become the standard by which the rest of the world measured air power, from the gray waters of the North Atlantic to the scorching deserts of the Middle East. The distinctive silhouette of the twin-engined fighter had become synonymous with technological superiority and combat effectiveness. The transformation was most visible on the flight decks of Allied aircraft carriers, where phantoms wearing the roundels and insignia of friendly nations stood ready to project power across the world's oceans. HMS Ark Royal pitched gently in the Mediterranean swells as Royal Navy F-4K Phantoms prepared for a training mission that would demonstrate British adaptations to the American design. Commander Michael Layard, Royal Navy, performed his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that characterized British military aviation. The Phantom he would fly carried modifications that reflected uniquely British requirements. Rolls-Royce Spey engines that provided improved fuel efficiency, strengthened landing gear for operations from smaller carrier decks, and communications equipment compatible with NATO standards, quite different from the American version, observed Lieutenant Simon Davies, Layard's radar intercept officer. But the basic bones are unmistakably Phantom. The British adoption of the Phantom represented more than a procurement decision. It was an acknowledgement that American aviation technology had achieved a level of sophistication that even the nation that had invented radar and jet engines couldn't match with domestic designs. The decision had been controversial within the British aerospace industry, but the Phantom's performance in Vietnam had made the choice inevitable. Similar scenes were playing out across the globe as nation after nation discovered that the Phantom offered capabilities that their domestic aircraft industries couldn't match. In the concrete hangars of Luftwaffe bases across West Germany, F-4F Phantoms stood ready to defend NATO's eastern frontier against Warsaw Pact aggression. Their pilots, many of whom had trained in the United States, brought European tactical doctrine to an American aircraft design. Oberst Hans-Joachim Müller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 74, had flown both American and German aircraft during his career, but the Phantom impressed him with its combination of technological sophistication and operational flexibility. "The Americans have achieved something remarkable," Muller confided to his operations officer during a planning session. "They have built an aircraft that adapts to different tactical requirements, rather than forcing tactics to adapt to aircraft limitations." But nowhere was the Phantom's global impact more dramatically demonstrated than in the skies over the Middle East, where Israeli Air Force F-4Es were rewriting the tactical manual for air warfare in desert conditions. Colonel Avihu Ben-Nun, one of Israel's most experienced fighter pilots, stood on the ramp at Hatzerim Air Base, watching the heat mirages rise from the concrete as his squadron prepared for a training mission that would push their Phantoms to the limits of performance in one of the world's most challenging flying environments. The Israeli Phantoms carried modifications that reflected the unique requirements of Middle Eastern warfare. Additional fuel tanks for extended range missions, electronic countermeasures equipment designed to defeat Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, and armament configurations optimized for both air-to-air and ground attack missions. In this environment, Ben-Nun explained to a visiting American observer, "An aircraft must be able to fight its way to the target, destroy the target, and fight its way home. The Phantom is the first fighter that can do all three missions without compromise." The proof came during the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israeli Phantoms achieved air superiority over multiple Arab air forces equipped with Soviet-supplied MiGs. The speed and range of the F-4 allowed Israeli pilots to strike airfields deep in enemy territory while maintaining the flexibility to respond to threats across multiple fronts. But perhaps more importantly, the Phantom's success in Israeli service demonstrated its effectiveness against Soviet equipment and tactics under actual combat conditions. American intelligence analysts studied Israeli combat reports with intense interest, recognizing that Middle Eastern air battles provided the closest available approximation to what air warfare between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces might look like. The global proliferation of the Phantom was forcing aviation establishments around the world to reconsider their approaches to fighter aircraft design and procurement. In Moscow, Soviet aerospace engineers found themselves under increasing pressure to develop aircraft that could match the Phantom's multi-role capabilities. The Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, responsible for the MiG series that had dominated Soviet fighter aviation since the end of World War II, faced the uncomfortable reality that their specialized aircraft were being outperformed by a single American design that could execute multiple mission types with equal effectiveness. Alexander Yakovlev, chief designer at the competing Yakovlev Design Bureau, summarized the challenge during a meeting of the State Committee for Aviation Technology. The Americans have fundamentally changed the rules of fighter aircraft design. We can no longer afford to build specialized aircraft for specialized missions when our potential adversary has one aircraft that excels at everything. The Soviet response would eventually manifest in aircraft like the MiG-23 and MiG-29, designs that attempted to match the Phantom's multi-role capabilities while maintaining Soviet design philosophy. But the very existence of these programs represented an acknowledgement that American aviation technology had achieved a breakthrough that forced the rest of the world to catch up. In Japan, the decision to license produce F-4EJ Phantoms for the Japan Air Self-Defense Force represented a similar acknowledgement of American technological leadership. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which had produced some of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft of World War II, found itself manufacturing American designs under license because Japanese technology couldn't match the Phantom's capabilities. The psychological impact extended beyond military aviation into the broader realm of technological competition between nations. The Phantom had become a symbol of American industrial and technological superiority, visible evidence that the United States could produce military equipment that the rest of the world couldn't match. European aerospace companies, struggling to compete with American designs in international markets, found themselves forced into collaborative programs that pooled resources and expertise in attempts to match American capabilities. The Panavia Tornado, a joint British-German-Italian project, was explicitly designed to match the Phantom's multi-role capabilities while incorporating European technological innovations. But even these collaborative efforts acknowledged the Phantom as the standard to be equaled rather than exceeded. Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, the companies responsible for the Phantom's design and production, had established a benchmark that would influence fighter aircraft design for decades. The aircraft's influence extended into realms that its original designers had never contemplated. NASA purchased F-4s for use as research aircraft, their high-performance capabilities making them ideal platforms for investigating flight phenomena at the edges of the performance envelope. The Australian government operated Phantoms in reconnaissance configurations that supported intelligence-gathering operations across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. By 1970, the F-4 Phantom was operational with 12 different air forces on 6 continents, a level of international adoption that was unprecedented in military aviation history. Each operator had adapted the basic design to their specific requirements, creating variants that reflected different tactical doctrines and operational environments while maintaining the fundamental characteristics that made the Phantom effective. The aircraft had evolved from a controversial experiment in all-weather fighter design to the defining military aircraft of the Cold War era. Its presence in the inventory of an air force had become a measure of that nation's technological sophistication and military capability. More subtly, The Phantom's global success had established American aerospace companies as the dominant force in international military aircraft markets. The revenue generated by Phantom sales and support contracts provided the financial foundation for the next generation of American military aircraft development, ensuring continued American leadership in aviation technology. In the gray corridors of the Kremlin, Soviet military planners studied intelligence reports on global Phantom deployment with growing concern. The aircraft that they had once dismissed as an expensive American mistake had become the backbone of Western air power, a technological foundation upon which American military strategy rested. Colonel Viktor Provolov, now a general officer responsible for assessing Western air power capabilities, prepared a classified report that acknowledged the magnitude of the Soviet miscalculation. The document, stamped with the highest security classifications, contained an admission that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The F-4 Phantom represents a fundamental advancement in military aviation that we failed to anticipate, Provolov wrote. Our assessment of American technological capabilities was incomplete, and our understanding of multi-role fighter requirements was inadequate. The Phantom has become the standard by which all other fighters are measured, and we have no equivalent capability in our current inventory. The report concluded with a recommendation that would reshape Soviet aviation development for the next 2 decades. We must fundamentally revise our approach to fighter aircraft design to compete with American multi-role capabilities. The year was 1979, and Captain Jennifer Harrison walked the flight line at RAF Alconbury in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath-forming clouds in the cold English air, as she approached the F-4G Phantom that would carry her on her first Wild Weasel mission. 21 years had passed since Bob Little's first flight in the prototype, and the aircraft that had once been dismissed as too complex for operational use had evolved into something approaching technological mythology. Harrison's Phantom bore little resemblance to the clean Interceptor that had first taken flight in 1958. Antennae sprouted from its fuselage like electronic quills, each one part of a sophisticated electronic warfare system designed to detect, locate, and destroy enemy radar installations. AGM-88 HARM missiles hung beneath the wings like electronic javelins, their guidance systems programmed to follow radar emissions back to their sources with lethal precision. "She's not pretty anymore," observed Captain Mike Rodriguez, Harrison's electronic warfare officer, as he completed his inspection of the aircraft's complex sensor suite. "But she's the meanest thing in the sky when it comes to hunting SAMs." The Wild Weasel mission, suppression of enemy air defenses, represented the latest evolution in the Phantom's remarkable adaptability. What had begun as an all-weather interceptor had transformed into a specialized electronic warfare platform capable of operating in the most dangerous air defense environments in the world. The aircraft's size, once considered a liability, had become an asset that allowed it to carry the electronic equipment necessary for deep penetration missions against sophisticated air defense systems. But the F-4G was only one example of the Phantom's continued relevance in an era when newer, more sophisticated aircraft were entering service. Across the world, Phantoms continued to serve in roles that their original designers had never imagined, their basic airframe proving adaptable to mission requirements that spanned decades of technological evolution. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, F-4D Phantoms served as adversary aircraft in the Red Flag training program, their pilots flying with Soviet tactics and procedures to provide realistic training for American aircrews. The aircraft that had once struggled against MiGs in the skies over Vietnam had become the platform of choice for simulating Soviet air tactics because its performance characteristics matched those of potential adversaries. Lieutenant Colonel Dave "Scar" Waterman, one of the most experienced adversary pilots in the Air Force, had flown the Phantom in both combat and training roles throughout his career. His assessment of the aircraft's longevity reflected the grudging respect that had developed among pilots who had initially viewed it as an overweight compromise. "The Phantom is like an old gunfighter," Waterman explained to a group of young pilots preparing for their first Red Flag exercise. "She may not be the fastest gun in town anymore, but she knows every trick there is, and she survived more fights than any of the new kids." The aircraft's survival in an era of rapid technological change reflected more than mechanical durability. It demonstrated design principles that had proven remarkably prescient. The Phantom's twin-engine configuration provided redundancy that saved countless air crews when single-engine failures occurred over hostile territory. Its large fuselage accommodated equipment upgrades that extended its operational life far beyond original expectations. Most importantly, its basic flight characteristics had proven forgiving enough to be safely operated by pilots with varying levels of experience and training. By 1980, the F-4 Phantom had achieved a milestone that no other fighter aircraft had reached. It had served continuously in frontline combat roles for over 2 decades while maintaining competitive performance against newer designs. The aircraft that critics had once dismissed as obsolete before it entered service had outlasted most of its contemporaries and showed no signs of retirement. The numbers told a story of unprecedented success in military aviation. Over 5,000 Phantoms had been built in various configurations, making it one of the most prolific fighter aircraft in history. It had served with the air forces of 12 nations, participated in conflicts on every continent except Antarctica, and established combat records that would influence aircraft design for generations. But perhaps most remarkably, the Phantom had achieved these accomplishments while continuously evolving to meet changing operational requirements. The F-4E that entered service in 1967 shared only basic structural components with the F-4B that had first flown combat missions over Vietnam. Successive variants had incorporated new engines, radar systems, weapons, and avionics that kept the basic design competitive with aircraft that were decades newer. Dr. James McDonnell, the visionary who had first conceived the all-weather fighter concept, lived to see his controversial design become the defining military aircraft of the Cold War era. In a 1979 interview shortly before his death, he reflected on the aircraft's unlikely journey from experimental prototype to global icon. "We knew we were building something different," McDonnell said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had seen his most ambitious project exceed every expectation. "But I don't think any of us imagined that it would still be defending freedom around the world 20 years later." The document that arrived on General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev's desk in early 1980 carried the kind of classification markings that indicated information too sensitive for distribution beyond the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Prepared by the GRU's Foreign Technology Assessment Division, it represented the culmination of 2 decades of intelligence gathering and analysis focused on a single aircraft that had fundamentally altered the balance of global air power. The title page bore a simple heading that concealed the magnitude of its contents: Assessment of F-4 Phantom Impact on Soviet Air Defense Requirements. General Viktor Provolov, now serving as Deputy Director of the Foreign Technology Assessment Division, had spent nearly 25 years studying American aviation developments. The report he submitted to the Politburo represented a professional lifetime devoted to understanding the implications of a single aircraft that had repeatedly confounded Soviet predictions and assumptions. "Comrade General Secretary," the report began, "we must acknowledge that our initial assessment of the American F-4 Phantom was fundamentally flawed. This aircraft has proven to be not merely a successful fighter design, but a revolutionary approach to military aviation that has influenced every aspect of air warfare doctrine and technology development." The admission was unprecedented in Soviet military reporting, which traditionally emphasized the superiority of socialist military technology over capitalist alternatives. But the evidence had become impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Soviet intelligence had meticulously documented the Phantom's performance in conflicts ranging from Vietnam to the Middle East, and the accumulated data painted a picture of American technological achievement that forced a complete reevaluation of comparative military capabilities. The aircraft that Soviet analysts had once dismissed as an overcomplicated failure had demonstrated combat effectiveness that exceeded the performance of every fighter in the Soviet inventory. More troubling from a strategic perspective, the Phantom's multi-role capabilities had allowed Western air forces to achieve the same mission effectiveness with fewer aircraft than Soviet doctrine required. A single Phantom squadron could perform intercept, ground attack, and reconnaissance missions that would require 3 different Soviet aircraft types, providing operational flexibility that translated into significant tactical advantages. The American concept of the multi-role fighter, Provolov's report continued, has proven superior to our approach of specialized aircraft for specialized missions. The F-4 Phantom demonstrates that technological sophistication, properly implemented, can overcome the supposed advantages of simplicity and specialization that have guided Soviet aviation development. The implications extended beyond immediate military considerations into the realm of industrial and technological policy. The Soviet Union had invested enormous resources in developing separate aircraft for interceptor, fighter-bomber, and reconnaissance missions, while the Americans had achieved superior overall capability with a single design that could be adapted to multiple roles. The economic efficiency of the American approach was particularly galling to Soviet planners who prided themselves on the rational allocation of socialist resources. The Phantom's development costs, high as they were, had been amortized across thousands of aircraft and dozens of variants, while Soviet specialized aircraft required separate development programs that multiplied costs without providing proportional capability increases. Even more damaging to Soviet prestige was the intelligence assessment of how Phantom technology had influenced aircraft development around the world. The report documented how European, Asian, and Middle Eastern nations had either purchased Phantoms directly or used them as the benchmark for domestic aircraft development programs. The F-4 has become the international standard by which fighter aircraft capabilities are measured, the report noted. Its influence extends beyond American military planning to shape the aviation requirements of allied and neutral nations throughout the world. The psychological impact of this global adoption was particularly significant for Soviet leadership, which viewed technological competition as a critical component of ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism. The widespread acceptance of American aviation technology suggested that capitalist production methods could achieve results that socialist planning had failed to match. Colonel Alexei Fedorov, now a senior test pilot and aviation technology specialist, contributed a technical assessment that was equally damaging to Soviet self-perception. His analysis of Phantom flight characteristics, based on intelligence gathered from multiple sources including defected aircraft and captured equipment, revealed design principles that Soviet engineers had failed to recognize or implement. The Americans achieved breakthrough performance not through revolutionary technology, but through superior systems integration, Fedorov wrote. They understood that modern fighter aircraft are weapons systems rather than flying machines, and they designed accordingly. This systems approach to aircraft design represented a fundamental philosophical difference between American and Soviet aviation development. While Soviet designers focused on optimizing individual components and subsystems, American engineers had learned to optimize the interaction between components to achieve overall system performance that exceeded the sum of its parts. The Phantom's radar system exemplified this approach. Rather than simply installing the most powerful radar available, McDonnell engineers had integrated radar performance with missile guidance systems, navigation equipment, and flight controls to create a weapons system that could engage targets beyond the detection range of enemy aircraft. Soviet fighters, by contrast, carried impressive individual components that often failed to work effectively together. MiG-21 pilots frequently complained that their radar systems provided excellent target detection, but poor missile guidance, while their navigation equipment operated independently of both radar and weapons systems. The report's conclusions were stark in their implications for Soviet military strategy and industrial policy. We recommend immediate initiation of programs to develop multi-role fighter capabilities comparable to the F-4 Phantom, Provolov wrote. Continued reliance on specialized aircraft will result in progressive degradation of Soviet air power capabilities relative to potential adversaries. The recommendation represented more than a procurement decision. It was an acknowledgement that fundamental assumptions about aviation technology and military strategy required revision. The Soviet Union would need to adopt American design principles and development methods if it hoped to compete effectively in future conflicts. But perhaps the most significant admission in the report was its assessment of the broader implications of American technological achievement. The F-4 Phantom demonstrates that capitalist production methods can achieve military capabilities that exceed those of socialist alternatives, the document concluded. This represents a challenge to our fundamental assumptions about the superiority of planned economic systems in military technology development. The report's impact on Soviet leadership was immediate and profound. Within months, new aircraft development programs were initiated that explicitly sought to match Phantom capabilities through Soviet design approaches. The MiG-23, MiG-29, and Su-27 programs all reflected attempts to achieve multi-role performance comparable to American standards while maintaining distinctively Soviet technological approaches. But the damage to Soviet confidence had already been done. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as an American technological dead end had forced the most powerful military establishment in the communist world to acknowledge the superiority of capitalist innovation in one of the most critical areas of military competition. In the end, the F-4 Phantom had achieved a victory that extended far beyond the tactical successes it had scored in aerial combat. It had proven that American engineering and industrial capabilities could produce military technology that the Soviet system, despite its vast resources and scientific expertise, could not match. The implications would resonate through the remaining decade of the Cold War as Soviet leaders grappled with the recognition that their ideological assumptions about technological development had been fundamentally challenged by the thunder of twin afterburners, echoing across the skies of the world. The morning sun painted the concrete ramp at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam with the golden light of another Pacific dawn as Master Sergeant John Chen performed his final walk-around inspection of F-4G tail number 69-7571. It was March 15, 1996, and this aging Phantom was about to fly its last operational mission after 37 years of service that had spanned 6 conflicts and 3 different air forces. Chen's weathered hands traced the aircraft's aluminum skin with the reverence of a man saying goodbye to an old friend. 37 years in the military had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of an aircraft that had given everything it had to give. The Phantom's paint was faded and patched, its panels bore the stress marks of countless high-G maneuvers, and its engines showed the wear of thousands of hours spent breathing fire and thunder. But it still flew. "Last dance, old girl," Chen whispered to the aircraft, his words carried away by the perpetual wind that swept across the Pacific island. "Time to take your bow." The mission was routine by the standards of the 1990s, a training flight that would test the aircraft's electronic warfare systems against simulated threats. But for the Phantom, it represented the end of an operational career that had redefined the meaning of longevity in military aviation. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the pilot who would fly this final mission, had grown up hearing stories about the Phantom from her father, who had flown F-4Ds over Vietnam. She understood the historical significance of the moment as she strapped herself into the ejection seat that had carried thousands of airmen safely through decades of conflict. "Control, Weasel 01 is ready for taxi," Martinez called over the radio, using the call sign that had become synonymous with the F-4G's specialized mission of hunting surface-to-air missile sites. "Weasel 01, cleared to taxi. Safe flight, and thank you for your service." The double meaning in the controller's words was understood by everyone on the frequency. The Phantom had served not just American air power, but the cause of freedom around the world, and its retirement marked the end of an era in military aviation. As the elderly fighter lifted off from the runway for the final time, its twin engines painting contrails against the tropical sky, observers on the ground felt a sense of historical transition that extended far beyond military aviation. The F-4 Phantom had been present at every major turning point of the Cold War, from the early skirmishes over Vietnam to the final confrontations with Soviet air power in the 1980s. 3 hours later, when Martinez brought the aircraft back to Andersen for its final landing, the gathered crowd included not just active-duty personnel, but veterans who had flown and maintained Phantoms throughout their operational history. Some had been there in 1965 when the first F-4Bs entered combat over Vietnam. Others had maintained the aircraft through decades of upgrades and modifications that had kept it competitive with designs that were 30 years newer. But the Phantom story didn't end with American retirement. Across the world, in the hangars of Allied air forces from Japan to Turkey to Greece, Phantoms continued to serve with distinction. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as an expensive mistake had become a permanent fixture in the international inventory of military aviation. In Greece, Hellenic Air Force F-4Es still patrolled the Aegean Sea, their presence a reminder of NATO's commitment to collective defense. Their pilots, trained by instructors who had learned their craft from American advisors, flew with the same precision and professionalism that had characterized Phantom operations since the aircraft's earliest days. Wing Commander Dimitrios Stavros, a veteran of over 2,000 hours in Phantom aircraft, reflected on the aircraft's enduring appeal during a briefing to younger pilots transitioning to more modern fighters. "The Phantom teaches you to be a complete pilot," he explained. "It demands respect, rewards skill, and forgives honest mistakes. But it never lets you forget that flying fighters is serious business." In Japan, Air Self-Defense Force F-4EJs continued to defend Japanese airspace with modifications that reflected decades of technological evolution. Their radar systems had been upgraded multiple times. Their weapon systems incorporated the latest missile technology, and their electronic warfare equipment rivaled that of much newer aircraft. Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka, who had flown Phantoms for over 20 years, summarized the aircraft's remarkable longevity in terms that transcended national boundaries. "The Phantom was built to last because it was built right. American engineers created an airframe that could grow and adapt as technology advanced. That's why we're still flying it 50 years later." But perhaps the most poignant testament to the Phantom's legacy came from an unexpected source. In the archives of the Russian Air Force Museum, a classified document from 1995 provided a final assessment of the aircraft that had once been dismissed by Soviet military planners. "The F-4 Phantom," the document concluded, "represents one of the most successful military aircraft designs in aviation history. Its multi-role capabilities, operational flexibility, and technological adaptability established design principles that continue to influence fighter aircraft development throughout the world." Soviet failure to recognize the significance of this achievement contributed to the technological gap that plagued our aviation industry throughout the Cold War. The admission, written by many of the same analysts who had originally dismissed the Phantom as an American folly, represented the final vindication of James McDonnell's vision of an all-weather fighter that could perform any mission in any environment. As the 21st century dawned, the F-4 Phantom remained operational. With air forces around the world, its distinctive silhouette still visible on military ramps from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The aircraft that had once been too radical for conservative military thinking had become a beloved classic, respected by pilots and maintainers who understood that true excellence in engineering transcends technological fashion. In every age, there are inventions that prove everyone wrong, machines that refuse to die even when newer alternatives promise to make them obsolete. The F-4 Phantom was one of them, a testament to the enduring power of visionary engineering and innovative thinking. Born from ridicule, forged in the fires of combat, and proven in the skies above 6 continents, the Phantom had earned its place in the pantheon of legendary aircraft through the simple expedient of being better than anyone thought possible. It had defended democracy, projected power, and saved lives in conflicts that spanned nearly half a century. The thunder of its twin afterburners had echoed across the skies of Vietnam and the Middle East, over the North Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, in the clear air above Arctic tundra, and through the turbulent atmosphere of tropical storms. Wherever freedom needed defending and wherever air power could make a difference, the F-4 Phantom had been there, its crews ready to prove once again that the aircraft everyone had dismissed could accomplish the impossible. As the final operational Phantoms continue to fly into the sunset of their remarkable careers, they carry with them the memories of thousands of airmen who trusted their lives to McDonnell's revolutionary design. They represent the dreams of engineers who dared to imagine that one aircraft could do everything, and the courage of pilots who proved them right. The sky remembers. And in the roar of jet engines climbing toward the stars, the ghost of every Phantom that ever flew continues to whisper the same message that had echoed through the halls of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, through the design offices of aircraft manufacturers and the ready rooms of fighter squadrons around the world. Sometimes the machine that everyone doubts becomes the one that nobody forgets. The F-4 Phantom had ruled the skies for 40 years, not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectible. A design so fundamentally sound that it could evolve and adapt to meet challenges that its creators had never imagined. In an era when military technology became obsolete within a decade, the Phantom had achieved something approaching immortality through the simple expedient of being exactly what the world needed, exactly when it needed it. And in the end, that was the most remarkable achievement of all.